Hi, I'm Tom, Chief Economist at Barbour ABI. With recent events challenging long-standing assumptions and a desire to build back better, we're releasing a hopefully timely set of articles about the future of construction, authored by Brian Green, commentator. Welcome, Brian.
Welcome.
So tell us a bit about this set of articles that you've kindly written for us.
Yeah, I think it's probably best if I start off by sort of providing the context to this, really. I mean, what happens is in construction, and we'll know this, is that there are periods of social, economic or environmental change, which changes the way in which we, the built environment works. So it changes where we work, it changes where we live, it changes what type of work that we undertake. And that means that there's a big change for the construction sector. So, I mean, to pick examples, we might look at probably one of the earlier cases would be the Industrial Revolution, where basically we moved from villages to towns and cities, and we created factories. So rather than building forges in a village, you would build a factory in a town, and that created urbanization as we know it today. A second period that might be worth considering is the post-war period, for instance, when after the war we decided that we wanted to create better places for people. There was a lot of reconstruction work that needed to be done, but also it was knocking down slums and creating a new environment for people to live healthier lives. I mean, the new towns would be part of that. And there's a fascinating period as well, I think, because it's in the lifetimes of many of us, which was the late 70s through to the end of the 20th century, really. And that period was quite fascinating because that corresponded with deindustrialization, where large numbers of people working in manufacturing were losing their jobs, and the creation and expansion of the service economy, which were very different jobs. And that tended to draw people to cities, to offices, or to shops. So the construction industry ends up, rather than building factories, builds shops and offices in large numbers. So you've got a point at which you were basically knocking down factories and then replacing them by and large with offices and shops. Now that, for construction, has quite big implications, because what tends to happen is that you get a surge of work associated with that because you're going through a transition. So there may not be as big a surge overall, but certainly there's a surge in certain sectors. So if we look at the late 70s, the 80s and the 90s, if you like, you get a point where you're looking at an increase in commercial work and a big reduction in industrial work. Now, if we kind of fast forward to today and we look at the kind of forces that are at play that might influence the construction sector, I mean, there are clearly numerous forces, but arguably the three most pertinent, I would suggest, are climate change, which we all know about and increasingly know about, and we've been watching that coming for some while, and we recognise how impactful that's going to be on the construction sector, not just in the changing regulations, but in terms of the whole impact on the economy generally. A second force, I would argue, is what might be regarded as a second wave of digitalisation. So the first wave of digitalisation, which was associated really with the change in the service towards the service sector, which was people going to offices. The change now is that rather than having it in going to offices, we have computing power on the go. So that's going to change things quite dramatically. We don't actually have to be in offices. And the third, which I think tends to be less appreciated in the construction sector, the third force I'd suggest would be demographic change. And that's not just about an aging population, it's about where people are. One of the consequences of the late 70s to the later period of the 20th century was that we had lots of young people going into cities because they were the ones educated to do those kinds of jobs. And so you had a distortion over that period. So I think I think that's really what we're looking at now, is the potential reversal of that trend. And what's, I suppose, on everybody's mind at the moment with the pandemic is the power that that's caused to seemingly accelerate these changes. The notion of working from home and the notion of people being more aware of the environment have certainly come through in all of this. And so what we're looking at is these massive forces that each individually are quite difficult to deal with, all coming together and then being accelerated. So that's really what we're trying to look at, these forces individually and how they impact on the particular form, say the residential, the non-residential and infrastructure. That's basically the theme of these pieces. And I think underlying that is actually to some extent to look back at history where we've made mistakes in the past and then look forward as much as we can to say, well, how can we avoid these things? So we're not trying to come up with answers, because it's not for us to decide what the world wants. But what we're hoping to do with these is to tease out some of the questions that we need to ask. But within that, I think there are certain themes that are emerging that are coming through these pieces, which I think are quite important.
Yeah, and it seems to me like it's quite timely, because obviously, the next 10 to 20 years is going to be absolutely critical to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I think there's more consensus than ever been to really, after 40 plus years of underinvestment in infrastructure and all those kind of things, that there's more consensus as ever been that we need to do something to improve and the benefits of good infrastructure and good built environment on people's lives. So I think hopefully that makes it a timely thing to be doing. Is that your view as well?
Well, definitely. I mean, I think people are being locked up. People are definitely appreciating just how impactful the built environment is on their lives and how important it is. I mean, the understanding of that is growing. We know that the built environment affects people a lot more than we may have imagined in the past, where we just saw a house or an office. Now we actually see them as environments in which people live, socialise. I mean, even the office people talk about today as places for people to socialise, and they recognise it rather than as a sort of a factory where people go to work in that kind of way. And I think these are important things, and I think the public is much more alert to that sort of thing. And but one of the things that I think is perhaps more important is that realistically, from a construction perspective, we need to have a clearer vision, because I don't think we have a notion, build back better, but we're not really answering the question, what does better mean? And I think we need to be careful about what we deciding what better is before we really think it through. And hopefully this will provide some food for thought, if nothing else, for the people that want to think about what possible things have happened, could happen, and reflect on some of the mistakes we made in the past. I mean, I think the one that comes to mind most immediately is when we talk about Build Back Better, we talk about the left behind. Now, we kind of forgetting there that the left behind are the left behind from the period of deindustrialization to some extent. And I think it's really important that we don't make those kind of mistakes again and then have to pick up the tab later down the line. I think they're the sorts of things we're hoping that this will stimulate thought and debate.
And one of the key themes, I guess, from your pieces, to me at least, seems to be the need for more joined up and integrated thinking in terms of how we go about thinking about what we need to build in the future and how that all looks and how that all works together. Is that how you feel as well in terms of?
Well, definitely. I think we need to look at these three forces, if you like, and how they work together rather than looking at them independently. We tend to over compartmentalize things and say, okay, this is a climate change problem, this is a demographic problem, this is a problem of digital economy. But we need to be able to look across the piece and see these things, and there will be local particular circumstances that we need to take into consideration as well. We need to look more holistically at these, because to some extent, and certainly through my life, I found that often two problems, when you put them together, one is the solution of the other. And I think that if we fail to look at them holistically, we will end up making mistakes. We might solve the climate change problem, but actually create something else. And I think that these are the dangers we've got to look to. But I think, again, coming back, if we've got a consensus of where we want to go, and that is agreed where we want to go, then that will help us determine the future, and we can tweak that as we go along, as we learn. But I mean, I think that's really quite important.
Indeed, and I guess how we might do that, thinking on a bit, as an economist, I certainly find that having a diversity of views often leads to a much better solution to a real world problem, rather than just sitting in a room on one's own and deciding what the answer is. Is that the same for construction, do you think?
Probably more so, I would have thought, given the demographic of construction. It's hardly representative, and I think that will lead to mistakes, because we always think instinctively from our own perspectives, and we can empathize, but it's better if you've got somebody in the room who can actually explain to you why you should or shouldn't do certain things, or why it might be a better idea to go this route rather than that route. And I think, so when we're looking at diversity, certainly we need to have significantly more diversity within the construction sector as a whole. And I mean, obviously firms are trying to address that, and and they should be applauded for doing so, and not before time also. But I think we also need diversity in the disciplines that we engage, because as we get more and more sophisticated, buildings become much more about people. So we really do need to understand people better. I mean, the example obviously that's often quoted is where people seek to ventilate a house, and they come up with a great design that ventilates the house, but it all falls apart because people don't use it correctly. Now, I mean, if we're building things that people don't use correctly, we have to understand why they're not using them correctly, and what might they use correctly. And those sorts of skills aren't necessarily resident in the broad construction sector. I mean, increasingly they are becoming there. They are coming into the sector, but I think we need to have a big push at that. And I think along with that, we also need, I think, to appreciate across the construction sector the importance of communities and how they work. Now, obviously, there are disciplines within the broader Church of Construction that deal with these issues, but I think they need to be much more at the fore than they are today. And I think diversity is probably a good way of describing that, both the types of people and the types of disciplines. So behavioural scientists, for instance, I mean, if football clubs can get them, I don't see why construction shouldn't.
Sure. Good point. And if there was, the kind of takeaway point from your pieces, what would that be?
Given that we don't live in brilliantly optimistic times, I'd like to be optimistic, and I'd like to think that this represents a potential for a golden era of construction, and it would be lovely to think that we can do something, and because I know a lot of people in construction really want to do something that will last, and put the construction industry in a good light, as opposed to the light that it is often cast in following previous enterprises such as this. I think this is a golden opportunity, and I think it's one that the industry should really look to grasp, and that would make me happy, and I'm sure it would make a lot of other people happy in construction. An
appropriate place to finish, I think. Well, thanks very much for joining me, Brian, today. And for all viewers, please do check out Brian's pieces. We're releasing one a week. Surely a great read. And please do keep the conversation going. So give us contact us if you've got any further questions. So thanks, Brian, again, and thanks very much, everyone watching. Cheers.
There you go.